So while I've got you here, I wanted to talk about this. I had to talk about this. This is the blind smartphone camera test video that you did. Couple million views on it. A lot of people talking about it. I saw people talking about it on Twitter and so on. Yeah. And I mean, the basic idea, the premise here is a bunch of photos. You don't tell anyone which smartphone camera they were shot on, and then you ask people, hey, which ones look the best?
It's blind.
Blind.
Truly blind.
That's why the word is in the title.
Yep.
The blind smartphone camera test, and you tested a bunch of cameras. How many total?
16, something like that.
That is a
full-on bracket play.
That's a ton of smartphone cameras.
Here's the thing, like when you have 16, they're not all gonna be great, right? So we have everything from the highest end iPhones to the Pixels, but then we go down the list, you go LG, you go Red, Samsung, then you suddenly have the OnePlus and the BlackBerry, and you're just kind of filling in the bracket. Mm-hmm. So the hardest part about that at the very beginning was making the bracket.
Right.
What do I blindly put up against the iPhone 10? Do I put another great phone or just sacrifice a BlackBerry against it?
When I watched the video, I actually didn't think about that.
Yeah.
But you're kind of right, because in a typical bracket fashion, you would have one seed versus 16 seed. Yeah. So the favorites would be more likely to make it through. What did you end up doing?
We kind of had sort of a seeding happening.
You attempted one seed versus 16 seed.
I think we essentially thought we'd end up with an iPhone and a Pixel at the end or something like that. So we didn't want to put iPhone versus Pixel in round one. Mm-hmm. So we kind of had a Huawei phone against a Palm phone, BlackBerry against an iPhone.
Yeah,
a lot of matchups like that in the first round, but spoiler alert, didn't quite go that way.
And that's actually why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
Because what ends up happening in this experiment here is that the results are not what anyone expected them to be.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's reasons for that. I mean, I immediately had my speculation on why that might be the case. In the video, you actually talk about it a little bit. But ultimately, I mean, we're going to kind of spoil the video a little bit here.
Yeah.
But some phones make it through this bracket that have no business, in most people's minds, making it through the bracket.
You would traditionally think certain characteristics would carry through and make the photo obviously better. But we did the tests and the voting on Instagram and Twitter. So it ended up kind of boiling down to putting them two side by side. People generally fell towards voting for the brighter, more saturated, more vivid one. Mm-hmm. Even though the highest end, best smartphone cameras we traditionally know as, you know, the iPhone and the Pixel, don't do the brightest, vivid, most crazy photos. They do sort of more neutral, more adjustable, gradable, higher dynamic range photos, which didn't win.
The interesting thing for me about this experiment, this video, was it brings into question the idea of good in general. Who gets to decide which is better? It's not strictly this is a higher resolution photo, it's which one do you like better, was the way it was positioned. And so when people went and picked phones that typically wouldn't beat, you know, like let's say the Poco phone against the iPhone 10, or the BlackBerry beats the 10s, like on paper, no one's supposed to pick that, but blindly they do.
Right.
Like, who gets to pick what's good and bad? Is it you and I? Or is it the general public? I mean, they had the same photos at their disposal.
Yeah.
Right? You had these photos. You published them on social media. After you saw them post-compression,
I blind tested myself a little bit.
That was what I was wondering.
So on my computer, when I'm looking at the full resolution, because we basically like cropped the two and put the top and the bottom next to each other. So I'm looking at the original files next to each other. Original files, I picked the higher end expected winner every time.
Right.
But then I put them on Instagram stories and I forgot about the letters and I tested myself and I voted for the crowd favorites, the upsets more often than not. And most of this was because when I'm looking at the original files on my iMac, they're high resolution, I can see the detail in one and the softness in the other, and immediately I picked that one. But yeah, we lost that particular characteristic of the high-end phones, and suddenly it's just like, well, I like the fact that I can see all the colors in one of them, and the other one looks a little muted, so I'll pick the brighter one.
So you had the same effect that the audience had.
It had the same effect on me, yeah.
You ended up picking the cheaper devices.
A couple times, yeah. Sometimes, and I also, like, I put 16 phones in because I wanted to eliminate the, oh, I know this is the Pixel, so I'll vote for it. So if it was A versus B, and I told you one's a Pixel, one's an iPhone, at a certain point, you can kind of identify a photo
Right.
shot on a Pixel
For sure, out of
and
the
just
bunch.
decide you
yeah.
want to pick one or the other. So when we had 16 options like this, it was like, well, every single time one of these might be the Pixel, and I was kind of like, I don't want to evaluate too hard. I just kind of glanced at it and picked one and moved on.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm just doing that, which is kind of like what most people do on Twitter anyway, I was picking the BlackBerry and the Pocophone.
Unexpected, but interesting nonetheless. The crazy part here is that these companies spend tremendous amounts of time and energy to create these amazing cameras that have completely replaced these gigantic systems that people have had in the past, and of course point and shoot cameras and so on. And then people end up taking these photos, and the only way we end up seeing them is on these networks, Instagram, Twitter, and your phone. And so people aren't, like, really what the story is about this particular video is that people are not sharing their photos and receiving their photos in such a manner that constitutes spending the extra money on the better camera in the first place.
You got to know what you want out of it. If all you want is to take a photo that's good enough for Instagram or Twitter, literally any of those phones will be fine. And I think that's what I learned, because I wouldn't have even wanted...
Every phone is an Instagram phone.
It's hard to find a really, truly bad phone nowadays. Right. But I think if you also value that, like, well, you know, Apple's running a Shot on iPhone contest where you can share your original images to be put on a billboard. Like, if you care about seeing them on as a wallpaper on your computer, or you want a little more detail or a little extra finesse for things like that, then you're actually looking at the top couple instead of just whatever looks fine on Instagram. Or if you take a lot of selfies, I don't know. There's all kinds of priorities. But if you know what you want out of a phone, that'll dictate what kind of weight you put into this test.
Right.
There's something to be said for, like, the extra work that gets put into pushing that bleeding edge of phones. That's why I carry the Pixel as like a camera.
Yeah.
Like I keep trying
amazing.
Like all these other phones, and I keep falling back to the camera.
That camera for me, side note, that camera for me was the most, like, just point it and shoot it.
Yeah.
Out of any smartphone camera I've ever used.
You tried night sight too?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's
great.
It's ridiculous. I mean, again, somehow in the blind test.
Blind tested, but it lost to, what did the Pixel? Oh, it lost to Mate 20 Pro.
Yeah.
Which then went on to
win the whole thing.
Really crush the whole thing.
Yeah. It did win the whole thing, right?
I think, yeah, it did.
Okay, so let me ask you something then in closing.
Pro.
Out of this entire bracket here, obviously the Mate 20 Pro ended up winning, but some cheaper devices like the Pocophone went all the way to the final round.
Yeah.
And now that smartphone cameras are such a differentiating factor for people, and one of the main reasons people will actually spend more on a smartphone, out of this group, which do you think represents the best value for money?
I think it'd be hard to argue with, if I'm just looking at this test, the Pocophone being one of the less expensive phones going so far. The BlackBerry, it's still, you have to like a BlackBerry. Like, there's a whole lot more baggage that comes with switching to a BlackBerry. But I think a lot of people who are like, oh, well, I'm on this older phone, I'm thinking about this Pocophone, but I don't know if the camera's going to be good enough. I think they can probably rest easy. Like, this is a good enough camera. If you want the highest end, the most detail, the most dynamic range, the test results won't really help you so much. But I found this really interesting the way it played out.
Which phone wins your bracket? Of, like, cost doesn't matter. You had you had full res files. You had your own taste buds.
Mate 20 Pro.
Oh, really?
And the reason is because, like, it took the brightest photos, and that's why it kept winning. But it was also very detailed and had a good amount of dynamic range. So you can pull down exposure if you don't like that high exposure if you want. That's just kind of like how some bias. Samsung biases a little high exposure. Apple tends to go a little lower. But I think looking at the raw files, if I blind tested myself with the raw files and not the compressed version, I think I would have ended up picking Mate 20 Pro.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.